Simon studied medicine in London at Charing Cross and Westminster Medical School. And after qualifying, he taught anatomy for a number of years at the University of Glasgow. And after initially following a path in neurosurgery, he then requalified in psychiatry. Following that, Simon completed an MA in Western Esotericism. It's the Exeter program at Exeter CISO, and with thesis work on Austin Osman Spare. He's interested in the interplay of descriptive psychopathology and the phenomenology of magical praxis and spirituality and psychosis, which I believe he's going to talk to us about today. Simon's currently reading for a PhD, also at Exeter, on Rider Haggard and the Imperial Occult. As you can see, title of his talk, Place of Snakes or Seraphs, Schizotypy, Esoteric, Hermeneutics and Paranoia. The floor is yours, Dr. Magus.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. In 1902, William James inquired in the Varieties of Religious Experience as to why it should be that some individuals found the magical and mystical in their experience of alterations in consciousness, and why some found madness, the place of snakes or seraphs, the place of seraphs or the place of snakes, respectively. In the following paper, I shall explore the relationship of kinship between what I shall call, for convenience, the magical mindset and the paranoid mindset. The term paranoia, from the Greek for beside the mind, is a lay term which strictly should no longer be used in a clinical setting where it has been replaced by persecutory ideation or delusion. In what follows, I shall employ some of the key psychophilosophical concepts of the oeuvre of the occultist and artist Austin Osman Spare to illustrate the transdisciplinarity between psychiatry and the modern academic discipline of Western esotericism. The emergence of psychology from philosophy and metaphysics on the one hand, and from occultism and spiritualism on the other, neatly parallels the life of Austin Osman Spare. Although often associated with 19th century occultism, he was only a year old when in February 1887, Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers first started promoting the newly founded Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. A contextualization of Spare's position in relation to modern psychology and the origins, or more accurately, the prehistory of academic Western esotericism, demonstrates that he was present at the bifurcation of occultism and psychology, the diverging studies of which would lead to the later disciplines of Western esotericism and psychiatry. Spare then stands at an important juncture in terms of the creation of modern psychologies, the shift from the world of fin de siècle occultism and spiritualism to modern clinical psychology, parapsychology, and the exploration of so-called psi-phenomena. The dominant emergent idiom of a dynamic unconscious is central to this development. Not everyone was entirely happy with the efflorescence of Jung and Freud. Austin Spare, in particular, was wary of this particular hermeneutic. He freely critiques it in the following comments. Psychology should be taken in small doses and not swallowed whole. To swallow it whole puts an end to common sense. It has even been allowed to override the law. And furthermore, psychologists have been converted into vehicles of enthusiasm for their own theories, with a labyrinth of dialectic meanings overloaded with a complex and transferred vocabulary that can mean anything and yet not mean that to which their words commit them. Although he freely criticized contemporaneous psychology in this way, he was simultaneously happy to appropriate, in terms of his own developing magical praxis, the Freudian id and the subconscious. He even deploys terms of descriptive psychopathology in modern use, such as echopraxia and echolalia. His thought is therefore very much representative of a hybrid psychophilosophy mirroring the psychological discourse of the period. In his monolithic work, The Discovery of the Unconscious of 1970, Henri Ellenberger has traced the origins of dynamic psychiatry to Franz Anton Mesmer and mesmerism, subsequently evolved by the Scottish surgeon James Braid into the concept of hypnosis. But here there is sadly insufficient time to consider this further. In the following account, I shall not be providing an exegesis on such Sparian concepts as Zos and Kia and the neither, but shall select some of Speer's ideas, which I think have a bearing on how we may view psychopathological concepts in terms of rehabilitating them to normalcy, and how they may provide insights into the paranoid or psychotic mind and the magical mindset of the esotericist. Where appropriate, I shall provide vignettes of case histories from my own practice, suitably anonymized. I shall examine how Speer is considered by some as a shaman, and how a psychiatrist may also be thought of as a kind of shaman or psychopomp. I shall then move on to consider aspects of descriptive psychopathology, schizotypy, and esotericism. I shall then consider Speer's concept of atavism, and finally I shall briefly consider the possible role of hemispherical laterality in Speer's praxis. Speer clearly used the praxis of altered states of consciousness during his creative process. He was using the method of automatic drawing 10 years before the Surrealist movement in Paris. Gary Latchman has recently argued that this state represented a form of what Mavromatis has termed hypnagogia, i.e. hypnagogic phenomena which occur between wake and sleep. It was by entering into this liminal space that Speer was able to populate the strangely lit landscapes of the phantasmal realms of his paintings with all the rich phantasmagoria with which we are so familiar today. But does this constitute shamanism? His paintings are on occasion suggestive of techniques of ecstasy. Apart from the hypnagogic state postulated by Lachmann, Speer also employed the death posture. This was a combination of hyperventilation and muscular rigidity, hands clasped behind the back, followed by relaxation and exhaustion, thus entering an altered state of consciousness. However, the entities encountered by Speer are given a psychological interpretation by him, i.e. they are derived according to him from his unconscious mind. This rather than representing the contact with animal spirits or sick souls carried out by the Tungus shamans in the locus classicus of Siberian shamanism. Similarly, he does not use hallucinogenic agents, at least I have not been able to report this previously. It is at the very least important to avoid the essentialist perspective of a worldwide shamanism. This brings me to the slightly disturbing notion that a psychiatrist might be considered as a shaman. I should like you to consider how the shaman and psychiatrist may perform similar functions, but go in opposite directions to do so. The doctor gives the patient the drug to bring him back to reality, whereas the shaman takes the drug himself to enter the reality of the patient. Who decided on that boring notion? Do you know what I mean? Anyway, I think it is useful to note the psychology inflection of the psychiatric term psychotomimetic for an hallucinogen, i.e. literally mimicking psychosis, rather than the culturally embedded 60s countercultural term psychedelics, implying mind broadening, or the more modern term entheogen, connoting sacrality. To conclude this section, here is yours truly on his shamanic ward round. There you go, enjoy. We now move on to the realm of descriptive psychopathology to consider how we may analyze the similarities and differences between the paranoid or psychotic mind and the magical mindset. One of the most difficult aspects of studying Austin Speer is his written language. Speer has his own idiolect, characterized by an idiosyncratic use of words, neologisms, zos, his self, subconsciousness, archaic and rare words, bizarre clausal construction, and abstruse semantics. He is overtly metaphorical and circumlocutory, a bit like me. In addition, possibly under the influence of Cornelius Agrippa and John Dee, in terms of its appearance, he created his own sacred alphabet, called by Kenneth Grant the alphabet of desire. In some of these respects, he provides evidence for what I would consider to be parallels in terms of cognitive structure between the magical mind and the paranoid mind. If we compare the language of psychiatry with that of esotericism, we can see some of these parallels. Effectively, we are describing the same or similar phenomenology, but changing the terminology. You don't have to go through it all. I'm just sort of giving you a few examples of what I'm thinking about. It is likely that some of these cognitive structures are hardwired and have a tendency to be more prevalent in certain individuals. To answer this question, I must first introduce the concept of schizotypy and schizotypal personality. Formulated by Gordon Claridge in the 1980s, schizotypy seeks to describe a normal variant of personality. which may be considered to represent a discrete entity along the spectrum of psychology from normalcy to mental illness. A schizophrenia trait, if you will, which is characterized by a number of features outlined on this slide. This is different from the pathologized International Classification of Disease, ICD10 criteria for schizotypal disorder, which are outlined here. Tests of individuals with high schizotypy scores have revealed, interestingly enough, that they may possess some advantage over normal controls in terms of creative ability. In a relatively recent study employing near-infrared spectroscopic technology, scans were carried out on samples of people with schizophrenia, schizotypal individuals, and matched controls, whilst carrying out tests involving creative activity. To take you through this slide, the upper left image is the position of the probes. Upper right is a summation of all the scans superimposed. Bottom right is the, bottom right as you're looking at it, Bottom right is the zero control. The image on the bottom in the middle is made of individuals with high schizotypy ratings, and the bottom left individuals with schizophrenia. These clearly demonstrate a greater area of activation or activity in the right prefrontal cortex of schizotypal individuals compared to those with schizophrenia or the controls. You will note, in terms of the concept of the right brainer in various New Age trajectories, that it is indeed the right hemisphere that it is involved to a degree in some tasks of verbal creativity. I shall now briefly consider some clinical cases from my own practice. So-called magical thinking often involves the concretization of metaphor. Concrete thinking in psychosis and in schizophrenia in general can often have unfortunate consequences. A 35-year-old man with a history of paranoid schizophrenia reported that he had difficulty in establishing relationships with members of the opposite sex. He had been brought to hospital by the police on a Section 136 of the Mental Health Act, having been reported by a number of people, members of the public, for grabbing a female passerby around the waist and lifting her into the air. He told the doctor that he had been trying to pick her up. The pound of flesh, yes, this one's not so funny. A 23-year-old male with a primary diagnosis of, A 23-year-old male with a primary diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and comorbid substance misuse was detained in a secure unit. During a psychotic episode induced by amphetamines, he had taken a garden spade to his mother and cut out her heart. He reported that he had wanted his pound of flesh, quite literally. A 32-year-old man with a history of paranoid schizophrenia was visited at home after reported deterioration in his mental state. He had written all over the walls of his flat. The writings contained bizarre delusional thoughts with mathematical and hyper-religious content. He had written 9/11 on the wall, but to him, this was a biblical reference to Corinthians chapter 9, verse 11. A 19-year-old man with a diagnosis of cannabis-induced psychosis presented with a self-referential preoccupation with numbers and their delusional significance. He had devised an alphanumerical code, A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, etc. In this code, the numerical value for April, the month of his birth, was the number of his house. There were other references to the death of the rapper Tupac. Anyone with an interest in Kabbalistical hermeneutics will recognize in this a simplified form of gematria. Thus we can see that what is a mystical hermeneutic in Hebrew and Christian Kabbalah can also be a psychotic hermeneutic in a paranoid psychotic mind. I shall now return to Austin Spare's ideas regarding atavism, or what Kenneth Grant called atavistic resurgence. Spare adopted the psychological ideas of a stratified psyche and a divided self. These ideas were commonplace at the end of the 19th century, notably in the work of Ernst Haeckel, Die Welträtsel, The Riddle of the Universe of 1899, in which he tellingly entitled 2 chapters, The Embryology of the Soul and The Phylogeny of the Soul. Spare describes a series of karmas which represent personalities from previous existences and even non-human forms. He says, all geniuses have active subconsciousness, and the less they are aware of the fact, the greater their accomplishments. Know the subconsciousness to be an epitome of all experience and wisdom, past incarnations as men, animals, birds, vegetable life, etc. Everything that exists has and ever will exist. Intriguingly, he seems to have anticipated the work of Paul MacLean, who postulated a triune brain theory. MacLean theorizes that there are three layers to the brain. The deep structures he calls the reptilian brain, concerned with the appetites, autonomic nervous system, and homeostasis. A mammalian paleocortex, concerned with the emotions and social interaction. And finally, the latest phylogenetic human edition of the neocortex, concerned with logic and ratiocination. Finally, and remaining within the compass of neurobiology, I shall touch briefly on the concept of cerebral lateralization. If we look at the frontispiece to Austin Spare's The Book of Pleasure, we can see that Spare appears to be closing his left nostril. This yogic technique is believed to stimulate the right hemisphere directly. The olfactory systems plug directly into the ipsilateral hemisphere rather than crossing over as nerve fibers do for many systems of the body. We have previously seen how the right hemisphere appears to a degree to be associated with divergent thinking and creativity. As a somewhat speculative afterthought, and it is speculative, it may be that there is indeed a neurobiological substrate to the notion of the left hand and right hand paths in magical praxis, the Dionysian right hemisphere controlling the left hand, the Apollonian left hemisphere controlling the right. This concludes my brief overview of magic and madness, esotericism and psychiatry, and I leave the last word with Austin Osman Spare. Schizophrenia, now considered psychopathic and a literary tag, is nevertheless one key to psychophysics. It is an essential part of general normality. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. We have plenty of time for questions, so...
I can't see anybody.
I can't see anybody either, so...
All under my spell, you see.
Okay, well, I'll just kick off the questioning then and give people a little time to think. Because I'm genuinely interested, has any scientific work, scientific research been done on this elusive thing called creativity that we've all been discussing?
It's interesting that I'm also interested in cerebral lateralization, and I think one of the things that... one of the difficulties is this notion of the left brain and right brain. It's a very old-fashioned idea. I delivered a paper not that long ago talking about neuromythology in Western esotericism. We're very fond of this idea of if you're a right-brainer, you're sort of creative and imaginative and so on and so forth, and if you're left, you're logical and you play chess and you're boring, basically. But actually my theory on that is that it's not that simple, and that we've created this division between the left and the right in terms of creativity because of the original split brain hypotheses of Sperry and so forth, which came after the division of the white matter between the hemispheres for epilepsy, which began in about the 40s, I think, something like that. But in terms of defining creativity, you see, the problem that you always come up against, I showed you that scan, but I don't want you to say, this idea of biological reductionism has to be resisted. I'll give you an example. It's going off the tangent of creativity, but they were studying some adolescents mostly recently in terms of how easily they trusted people. Just normal, not people with mental illness at all. And they were scanning them and doing quantitative analysis of how much a certain brain area lit up. And they gave this as a quantitative analysis of trust. Now, you can't really... So the idea of reducing something as complex as creativity to biology, I think, should be avoided. But it's interesting. Those were tests of verbal creativity, and they were looking at sheets and picking certain words while the brains were being scanned. But that's very limited. And actually, there's much more, there's a lot of front sort of front-back difference in the brain as well, and superficial and deep as well, rather than that division. But creativity is, as you say, elusive. So I haven't got any new news for you on that.
Glad to hear that, actually. Okay, anybody have any questions for Dr. Magus?
I have a question. I wonder if in this war where there is no frame for these states of mind that can create that people who are naturally psychic, they develop schizophrenia.
Oh, people who are naturally psychic?
Yes.
And schizophrenia. I don't know the answer to that. I think you're mixing and matching models. I mean,
Okay.
we do that in psychiatry anyway. But you see, if you're sort of talking about psi phenomena, you're going off into a leaning back. You're launching into a different sort of model.
Okay.
So.
Maybe you could talk about a little bit about what we were talking about outside with like the societal view of psychosis and what makes psychosis, and how if we can have a different understanding of it and use, like when someone's having certain symptoms, like help them use their creativity or develop a magical practice or somehow channel it into the arts or some way rather than just having them end up in the hospital.
Yeah, I mean, as you probably gathered from the talk, I'm in the business of depathologizing. But this is not, I'm not extending that as far as the myth of schizophrenia, and that schizophrenia is socially constructed. Because if you think schizophrenia is socially constructed, let me take you by the hand and lead you to a psychiatric intensive care unit, all right? And there's a lot of evidence that there's a biological basis. But I think certainly when people are floridly psychotic, you can't really sort of start asking them to do magical rituals. It's not going to happen. I think that would just make them more ill. I think also there's in terms of psychoanalysis with schizophrenia, I think the current practice is that you can have a cognitive approach, but not necessarily an exploratory approach. But I think when people are well, or when at least they're mentally stable and their symptoms are residual, then you might think about how to reframe the symptoms that they're experiencing, and maybe in a psychospiritual context. I think it's quite an interesting point, actually, that one of the most difficult things that I have to deal with is and why I'm interested in spirituality and psychosis is how you differentiate between religious fervor and a psychotic episode. Because especially, for instance, with Pentecostalism, where you have the descent of the Spirit, speaking in tongues, sometimes collapsing on the floor, and it's very demonstrative, and it's sometimes it is difficult, and of course you do get people who are both Pentecostal and psychotic. And I don't take an anti-Christian or a particularly anti-patriarchal stance. Incidentally, I'm just sort of laying it on the line for you.
There's a lady down at the end.
Thank you. I have a few friends who are part of the. I have a few friends who are part of the Hearing Voices Network.
Okay.
They're people who might be known as psychotic. They hear a lot of voices.
Mm-hmm.
Testing. Result. And in that context, I've been quite interested to hear of some recent research which does seem to suggest that the culture within which you are raised affects the kind of voices that you hear, and also your response to those voices.
Yeah.
Insofar as people who hear voices in the UK and the US tend to perceive this as a negative thing in general. Quite often the voices are quite critical or judgmental, whereas people who've grown up in, I think the research looked at West Africa and India, and in contexts where it's much more normal to be hearing messages from the dead, and to that extent, I suppose the point being that there does seem to be some evidence that there is a social
Oh, there
context
is
for
an
the
element
form
of it,
that.
certainly.
Yeah.
I think what you're talking about is that the form remains the same, but the content shifts. And yes, I think that's well recognized. I refer a lot of people to the Hearing Voices groups. I mean, that's as standard. But in terms of it's an interesting point. I mean, because I had one patient, and she heard the voice of God, and it was very comforting. So do you think I'm going to give her an antipsychotic? No, of course I'm not. What am I going to do that for? Especially if she's on her own, because if I switch it off, she'd be lonely then, won't she?
Yeah, I think.
Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. And this is very much seems to condition what you're talking about here. And
Someone over there.
In the, I think it was a book by Julian Jaynes, The Origins of Consciousness and the
Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind.
That's the one, yeah. Aside from the main theory, there's sort of a side theory that effectively in prehistoric times the right brain, for want of a better word, would command the left brain through some sort of unknown symbology to perform actions, and that was a default state of being in animal consciousness or whatever. Just like to get your opinion on those theories of there being some point at which the rational thought process would take over.
Well, I can tell you from the outset that it's predicated on a split brain thesis, which I don't agree with anyway. So I think, James, I think the other thing is, I think that I have read the book, though, many years ago, is that I think he seems to think that the voices of the gods in pre-Homeric times were actually a similar sort of thing, that they were the voice of the right hemisphere or something along those lines, and relates it to auditory hallucinosis. But I can't believe that it's been such a short period of time before we'd have that breakdown in the bicameral mind. Do you see what I mean? I don't sort of... I think it's just too a short period. So that's my view on it anyway.
Yep, maybe in the front here. Maybe I should. Well, everybody else needs to hear as well. So. Okay. Yeah.
I'm born in Switzerland, but now I live in Italy, and I'm really happy to be here and listen to all this. When I was born, I couldn't accept the reality in which I was born. And I got aware only in this last period of my life, in this last 15 years, that I got very big injuries all the time on my head. And so my question was, since it happened on a rhythmic kind of time, it helped me to get in touch with other realities, and I'm happy. And
well, I'm not good.
Just understand if this injury.
Good. I'm not denying you your happiness. I'm just
not happiness. It was like if when you're not accepting a reality, having injuries is something that sort of clicks, gives you a shift. That was the question.
I don't understand.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Could it be a subconscious cause? Could you actually lead yourself?
Well, are you saying that you think that you have repeated injuries because you have
reality,
yeah. I would defer to my learned colleague as a psychodynamic practitioner. What do you think?
Compulsion.
What do you think?
I mean, I don't even understand what you mean by not accepting reality, like the societal reality that you're born into, or
the timing, like in Switzerland, the mathematical, mechanical timing, what people were talking about, it was not in my interest. I couldn't understand why people were living the way they were living.
Sure.
It was so boring.
I think a lot of us feel that way sometimes.
Yeah, that's the reason why I risked my life. I mean, by injury, I was really
trying to get a way out. Yeah, trying to get a way out.
It's a sort of a self-harming behavior. Is that what you're saying?
Until you invented your own way of being or found a place that you could be that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got there eventually.
Okay.
Just until
Language is different.
Yeah, well, we're a truly international conference indeed. So thank you very much, Dr. Magus. Thank you very much for your questions, everyone. And just give us a second to do the text setup.